Hey, it's me, Brian. I am back for another amazing episode, another fantastic conversation of entrepreneurial thinkers. Today, we dive into the topic of venture capital and diversity in venture capital. And the conversation that I get to have with my friend Megan Stevenson-Krausz, who is a repeat alumni of our show from back in 2021. She joins us today to talk about her role as co-CEO of Diversity VC, which is a UK-based firm that's working inside the venture capital industry worldwide to help these firms and the industry as a whole to better diversify itself, but not for the simple kind of grabby, headliney reasons that you would think, right? It's really just about diversifying the economic opportunity for all. And in doing so, you wind up creating greater economic growth, greater economic opportunity, greater returns for the institutional investors that invest. So if you're a young, aspiring venture capitalist, if you're someone in the industry who wants to see it do better and be better, if you are an established leader inside the venture capital industry here in the US or somewhere abroad, this is a conversation that I am 100% convinced you will find fascinating. You will find it informative and very great detail, and you will find it very prescriptive. You'll find some very specific things that Megan talks about that they do in their work that help the firms that are members of their community to succeed across the board in the growth of their funds, as well as in diversifying their points of view. So fascinating conversation with an old friend. That's the best kind of conversation to have. And I hope you enjoy it as much as we did making it. Hola, hello, hi, bienvenido, and welcome back or welcome to Entrepreneurial Thinkers, the show, as you know, where I get to have weekly conversations with the best and brightest entrepreneurial thinkers across all sectors and segments of society and industry, as we come together conversationally to try to leave this world just a little bit better than we found it. Today, I'm super excited to be joined again by Megan Stevenson-Krausz, who's now the co-CEO at Diversity VC. Let me tell you a little bit about Megan. Megan is an alumnus of the show. That's why I'm so excited to have her back. She's one of our earliest guests. In fact, I had to go back and look at it. It's from way back in the summer of 2021 when the show was in its previous incantation and it was a whole different vibe. But it's really, really exciting to have watched her journey since then and to have her back today to discuss a little bit different angle on the work that she's doing. So back then, we explored her unconventional path into venture capital and to Latin America, Peru specifically. She's been a driving force since then for equality, accessibility, and greater diversity in venture capital on a global scale for years now, really, honestly. She's a passionate and compassionate woman, leading in an industry that is still relatively dominated by men. She does so by leading now Diversity VC's regional expansion into Latin America. She helped co-author the region's first intersectional diversity report, which we're going to talk about some of the results of later, and recently has taken on greater leadership inside this UK and US based firm, where her work bridges all of our economies kind of towards more greater inclusion. Her sense of empathy, in my humble opinion, and her understanding of people and culture is seeded by a career that has spanned nonprofit leadership, VC investing, and global impact, and one in which she has consistently championed underrepresented founders and big, bold ideas. Megan's personal story, which is fascinating and which we talked all about in that 2021 episode, which you can go back and listen to it anytime you like, began near Philadelphia and includes building up an investment firm, Inca Ventures, in Lima, Peru. It reflects her dedication to creating opportunities that empower community, right? And now, as the co-CEO of Diversity VC, she's helping shape the future of equity in venture capital for all participants. And that's why we wanted to have her rejoin us today to help us take a look forward in this kind of relatively present moment of uncertainty. So welcome back to me, but welcome to the newly branded Entrepreneurial Thinkers, Megan. It's so great to have you.
Thanks so much, Rob. Wow. Can I take you around with me everywhere? I think that was the best intro I've ever received. I'm honestly so touched and honored. Thank you.
I thank you for saying that. I always like to joke in response to that, because that comment does happen often, is that it's easy to read those types of words because it's you, right? This is your life story and your career, and it's exciting to just have a chance to have us share this conversation about what we're going to talk about with our audience, because we know we have such a wide-ranging audience of people who are interested in fundamentally the same things that you and I are obsessed by or curious about. So with that said, I'm just going to drop the bomb question on you right away, and then we're going to be able to run from there. So if you prepared for this, at least you've got some thoughts ready, right? So why is diversity in venture capital so important? Like, why does diversity matter?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. And the way I think about it, and the reason, because look, as you mentioned in the intro, my background spans a lot of different spheres, let's say. Like I did a master's in human rights. I started out in the nonprofit space, went to VC, and now I'm back in nonprofit, but within VC. And a lot of folks ask me, like, but why do we need a nonprofit in venture capital? Venture capital, like, there's a lot of money in VC. Like, why do we need nonprofit? And the reality is that venture capital has been this very opaque, closed door sort of old boys club, quite frankly, almost secret society for most of its existence. And so, the reason why Diversity VC was started in 2016, this was far before I actually got involved in the UK with a group of investors and founders who wanted to change that and make it easier to understand and sort of peel back the layers of that black box and understand, well, what is venture capital? How does one get into it? Whether that's as an investor or as a founder. And I think part of the reason why it took off in the way that it has is because there's a recognition that, look, when you're as an investor, because that was, as you mentioned, previously my role, right? We think about building a diversified portfolio, right? It's about diversifying risk. So at its core, right, if we're talking about diversity, in some ways, and we often actually, when we host events, we often ask folks sort of like, what does this mean to you? And one of the questions or one of the answers is always about risk mitigation, right? There's some folks who think about it as like building a diversified portfolio is about risk mitigation. Now, what does diversity and diversifying your portfolio mean to you is something else, right? And what we also, the way we also like to think about it is this is about generating alpha. Most of our fund members are not impact funds. These are finance first venture capital funds. And they firmly believe that in order for them to generate the best returns for their LPs, they need to build that diversified portfolio, right? So it's not only about risk mitigation now, it's actually also about maximizing returns. But then when you think about what does that mean, it's not just about diversifying sector or stage. That's a thesis question there, right, in terms of the fund. But it's also about diversifying who are those founders? What are their backgrounds? Where do they come from? Now, what that means to a fund is going to depend on the backgrounds of those fund managers also, right? And the thesis and the sector that they're looking at. And so for some of our fund managers, maybe they're focused on food tech. And so food scarcity and food security is something very important to them. And so when they're thinking about diversity, they're thinking about, well, who's at the bottom of the pyramid? Socioeconomic diversity, gender diversity, racial and ethnic diversity. Other folks might be thinking about it from a perspective of all of those and more, perhaps thinking about nationality and experience from, different in terms of immigration. So, diversity can be a very broadly interpreted term, but I think fundamentally the reason why it matters and what it comes down to is that there is, genius exists everywhere, right? There's the famous phrase, like, genius is
there's talent is talent's every or evenly distributed, but opportunity isn't.
But opportunity is not, exactly.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And at the end of the day, the venture capitalist's job is to find outliers that are going to generate outsized returns for their investors. Now, I would argue that most of the industry is not actually investing in outliers anymore. And that's where I think, and we can get to that later, but that's where I think some of the work comes in terms of actually, so if you truly do believe in seeking out like the best talent, then you should be broadening your pool to everyone. And that's where having a diversity lens comes in.
I love that.
And also, I know we'll probably get into more of this again later as well, but it's not just if you want to be investing in more diverse founders, then you also need to have a more diverse team. Because we know also that folks tend to invest in people like them. It's natural. We gravitate towards people with whom we have something in common. And so, and also lived experience often ends up being a very important factor in how we evaluate a deal. So
100%
when you
true.
have more folks with more different lived experiences, you're much more likely to get to see many more diverse deals
No,
and
I
see the
love
value
that.
in it.
I love the, thank you. I love the, both the depth and then I'm going to pun intended here, right? The diversity of the answer that you just gave, right? I mean, because what you did, you just made a case for why diversity is important in venture capital from multiple points of view related to the fundamental purpose of venture capital, which, as you said, is to manage and invest the monies that are invested into their funds by other wealthier organizations, institutions, individuals, et cetera, and then create outsized returns for those people, right? And so fundamentally, diversity across essentially each of the operational lenses through which you would look at any venture capital firm anywhere, diversity and diversification should be at the core of that, that's awesome. That's great to hear. Now I want to turn it a little bit more personally on you, since again, you have this rich, deep background across so many different sectors and segments. And then you just explained what I think is a really thoughtful explanation in part of what some of the value of diversity VC can bring to the marketplace and to its clients. Let's talk about you. What does diversity mean to you? How do you define diversity?
I go back to Sesame Street.
I love that.
So, which I think we talked about last time
Yeah.
that I wrote.
Can we all go back to Sesame Street? Can we just go back to Sesame Street, please?
I was recently reading books with one of my best friends' 2.5-year-old son. And he had those hardcover cardboard books from Sesame Street that said, "We are all different. We are all the same."
Done. Mic drop, right? I mean,
Right?
the lessons we learn in kindergarten, as they say.
Yes, absolutely. I think I keep going back to Sesame Street because it's true. We have so much more in common than we do differences, and at the same time, our differences are worth celebrating. They're what make us unique. They're what make the world interesting. And it's almost like I know there's a lot of debate sometimes over should we talk about the U.S. as a melting pot or as a salad or as and I kind of like the idea of a salad or maybe even like a risotto where, it's like all of the pieces and flavors, you can catch them individually, right? Like individually they're delicious and they're important and all together they create this even more delicious whole.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And so, diversity can be gender, it can be religion, it can be sexual orientation, race or ethnicity, educational background, immigration background. I mean, and somebody might look at me and say, and my CV and say, okay, Megan is a white woman from a middle class background, went to a private high school and university, has a master's degree. Okay, those are all true, right? Those are all aspects of my identity. But it's not possible to know from looking at my CV that my grandparents were Holocaust survivors who came over in 1939, were the only ones in their family who survived are those who got out. My dad whose parents those were, raised me Jewish. My mom's mom raised me Christian. My mom's kind of agnostic.
Yeah.
I grew up going to church and singing in church choir. I also went to a Muslim preschool where I would go every year for Ramadan break fast, and I continue to, be a part of that community. I went to a Quaker elementary school. These are all aspects of my identity that are, I would say, actually even more critical and crucial to who I am as a person, but are impossible to know on the surface. And I'm sure the same is true for you, Rob.
Yeah,
And most of your guests.
100% true, and it's one of the things I've come to love about this show, from just a purely selfish exercise standpoint. Right, is when people say to me, how is it that you choose the people that you interview? Some of them are folks that I know. Some of them are now as the show has grown and persisted on. Now we're beginning to have folks like yourself who've been a part of the show, as we call alumni, very specifically, right? Because we say you're more than just transactional one-time guests. right? You are literally part of a community of people, and it's a very different community of people that look at the world, or as you say, have a lived experience in the world that is very different than mine, right? As a 56-year-old white straight single male who lives in Southern California, right, and who's a dad who has a 31-year-old daughter and is now a grandfather, and all these things that are part of my identity. But as you say, like most of the world is not me.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think it's really crucial.
I've come to appreciate that, right? And as I've aged and matured, I've come to appreciate that. Then I've just decided to lean into it, both in this, but also just in general, and how I approach my life and where I live and how I walk amongst the world. It's because to me, the rest of the world is far more interesting. I joke oftentimes, you've heard me say this probably before, right? I already know how, like, guys that look like me, feel like me, grew up like me, I already know how we look at the world. And I already know kind of how most of us move through the world. So that's not interesting to me anymore. Now I'm fascinated by how everybody else looks at the world and how everybody else moves through the world. And that's where the real lessons are, because as you've told us previously, and we both know is true, and our audience knows very, very factually, right? In the United States, as an example, but worldwide, but like in the United States, like we're rapidly changing the demographics of our country, and we are becoming a much more diversified, fundamentally diversified version of ourselves. Almost kind of, we're going through another period of like a big boost, like we did after World War I and World War II. And then therefore the nation is wrestling with that, right? Just like we wrestled with it back then, 80 to 100 years ago. But the inevitable end game is we wind up a much more diverse, as you say, salad of ingredients that then also ultimately will make us that unique thing that we are. And that's going to happen no matter how much everybody fights it along the way. That is inevitably going to happen. I've just decided, like, well, since it's going to happen, let's just skip all this nonsense and let's just lean into that and understand the world that way. And that's much of what you're saying as well, an appreciation for others.
Yeah. Actually, something that you just said reminded me. Firstly, I just want to say I think it's really what you mentioned about being a parent is something that's super crucial, and right, something that I didn't mention because it's so not on my radar is I'm not a parent, right?
Yep.
And so see right there, that's and actually something that we're seeing in the venture capital space that I mean actually writ large, right, is a huge divide in terms of how do different gender roles as parents impact their careers, right?
Mm.
And the other thing that you just said that triggered something for me is I was literally just, I think yesterday, I stumbled on a news clipping that I saved from an article about Andy Grove. Prior to him ever being a name anywhere, about his graduation from, I think it was City College in New York.
Okay.
And don't quote me on where he went to university. I may have gotten that wrong, but it was about his college graduation and basically talking about how this brilliant mind, who he was one of the folks who came over from Hungary after the 56 revolution or attempt, and that when he came here, he didn't know how to say, parallel or what, in English, but that he graduated in maths or something like that. And right. And so there are innumerable Andy Groves out there
Yep.
right now that maybe they're coming into the country and they don't yet know English, but they will, and can then hopefully contribute to our economy.
I love that yours, and thank you for asking mine, but I love that our answer to kind of how do we define diversity, again, reflects why you believe it's important to the industry. Right. So let's talk about this industry for a little bit here. It's notoriously dominated by it's roughly like, let's say 50-ish years old, right? Or late 60s, early 70s in the US was kind of as it was crafted into what we now as an industry. So it's a little bit younger than me, I always like to say, but it's still from its start to still today, essentially largely dominated stubbornly by men, and men, I'll just say men of privilege, right? And when I say men of privilege, I'm replacing in the US, it's white men. But outside the US, obviously, it still is dominated by that same kind of profile. It's just they're not white, or they're not, they're not American Caucasian. Why do we think that is? Just that, like, why do we think it is still this many years into its existence, still so stubbornly dominated by men?
If this were an easy question, then maybe we would have solved it by now. Or rather, if there were an easy answer, maybe we would have solved it by now. Like, I think there's a lot of different factors at play here, not least of which is there's an element of, just as when we talk about flywheels and startups and that one thing begets another, those happen in both positive and not so positive ways, right? And so when something has always looked one way, often it will continue to be that way, right? Because if you can't see it, you can't be it or imagine being it. And also, let's face it, up until, I mean, I know it was, I don't know the exactly when, but I know within my mom's lifetime, you know, she has finally received the right in the US to have her own bank account and her own
Right.
credit card without being co-signed by a husband, right? So, like,
Yeah, exactly. All that, I'm 56. All that is within
yeah,
my lifetime. Yeah.
I'm sure, right. So these are, we also have to recognize that, like, it was not so long ago. And so if we think about it that way, I think we can also recognize that we have made some very positive changes and moved in a positive direction. One thing we just mentioned actually earlier was being a parent. And there is research that shows that the most impactful thing you can do as a company or a fund or entity to close the wage gap, as well as the sort of like achievement gap between men and women in your fund or company, is to have both men and women take family leave, parental leave, the same amount and all at once. So what we often see happen is that, first of all, women usually are given more maternity leave, right? Also, there's often a imbalance between, in terms of, for same-sex couples, where they might either the birthing parent, or if they're adopting, right, they often don't necessarily get the same family leave that heterosexual couples receive, and so that's another issue as well. But if you give family leave that is equal to, regardless of if you are a same-sex couple or not, or if it is birthing parent or adoption, essentially what normally happens is that the birthing parent takes their full amount of parental leave because they need to, which in the US could be anywhere from 6 weeks to, or less, quite frankly, but to, some of the funds will give like 6 months. That's like a sort of a best case scenario. And the non-birthing parent might take 2 weeks off.
Right.
Maybe if they have a few more weeks, they'll take them at different different junctures, right? So they might take 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there, 2 weeks there. And the reality is that when you're taking, let's say, 4 months off, you actually have to disconnect, right? Like, you are not able to keep the tabs on your inbox and be sort of like monitoring it, even if you're not really responding. And so you actually have to have a process of sort of moving out and then moving back in from the job. If people are only taking 2 weeks at a time every month or so, like, it's just not the same experience. You're
Right.
never actually having to hand over an entire project or a deal. And so there's not the same loss, quite frankly, that happens for the birthing parent when they're taking this kind of leave. So, it's
I
where
love this. I
possible.
love this as a prescription for something that that a firm can do to create
Yeah.
a greater equity. That's fascinating. It
So
seems
where
like such
possible.
a subtle thing, but obvious.
Yeah, I get it. I know it's hard, and it's particularly hard when you're the GP of a fund, right? You're the partner or you're the founder, but I've seen partners do it. Our board chair and co-founder, she took a full 4 months off
That's
on
terrific.
maternity leave, and was actually offline, until about, I
It's
think I started to see her monitoring her inbox maybe about a month before she was coming back. But yeah, it makes sense. Look, you've been out for 3 months and you need to start
sure.
sorting through.
But
Um,
I will promise you, this is completely anecdotal, not from any study or research basis, but she'll be a better investor. She'll be a better mentor to the founders in the portfolio. She'll be a better investor. She'll be a better representative for their institutional LPs. 100% guarantee that. And here is why I can say it with such confidence. I'll inject two personal stories that you'll find great satisfaction in and a little bit of fun. So in my case, 1993, there was no leave. And I took all of 2.5 days away as the non-birthing parent, right? Which is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. And it's laughable now in the context of the story I'm about to share. So this will be the first time that Henry, my daughter's fiance, has ever made the podcast in a mention, after I mention her all the time, which she gets really tired of. But so they are literally going through that right now. So my new grandson, little baby Leo, it turned 2 months old today. And
Congratulations.
Yeah, we love Leo. He is the best.
Is this Leo's first mention on the podcast?
This probably not Leo's first mention on the podcast. Yes.
Not.
We have no visual record of Leo because his parents are dutiful millennials and they're keeping
Absolutely.
him off social media, and grandpa has been banned from reposting or sharing anything, but Leo has been mentioned, I'm pretty sure. So we're 2 months today. Henry's company just happened to be a very progressive, forward-looking software company. And he is also a very talented, very wildly important young, burgeoning executive there, a young staffer. And so their leave is, I think, like 16 or 18 weeks. Paternity leave for the father.
Right.
Right.
Hey.
Now, conversely, on the other side, my daughter works in the entertainment industry. And so her benefits are driven by her union membership. And therefore, if people who don't understand the entertainment industry, which I didn't a couple of years ago, but I do now, it's much more of almost kind of freelance type of a relationship with your programs or your shows that you might be attached to, et cetera. So she's literally between shows, right? So she's fun employed, but taking advantage of the benefits of the union, which paid for an incredible birthing experience at Ronald Reagan Medical Center at UCLA, and all the necessary pre and postnatal care. It's awesome. So the two of them, and I say this because I'm really just proud of the both of them, and I've said this to their faces, so it's not a secret, how I have witnessed the two of them functioning together as a couple, and then in their new role as parents, and just as human beings, having known one for 31 years and having known the other one for 7.5 years, and having known them together for that period of time is fascinating. Like, they are the most grounded, centered, thoughtful, joyful, peaceful, still exhausted, still don't know what they're doing, still trying to figure out all the parenting stuff, right? But they are doing it together in sync with a level of healthy communication and collaboration between themselves that I've never seen. And they have a really good relationship, notwithstanding this current pregnancy and baby. So the fact that they're doing it better now is all, to me, testament to the fact that he literally disconnected and handed off his projects and role to his company, and then said, "I'm done, and I'll be back in at the end of February or something." And she is of mind, and they planned themselves financially, and they prepared themselves over the last year for this journey. It was all very intentional, and they're really good at planning that. And I'm seeing she's an aspiring writer in Hollywood. She works on television shows in different capacities already for a number of years. And I've told her a number of times, she will be a better writer. She'll be a better storyteller. She'll be a more effective communicator when she goes back. And he will have a level of perspective on his young career that he's never had. So those are just anecdotal examples of what I believe you were saying is 100% true. And in this industry, if that also then leads to those people as professionals, not as family, for me, kind of re-entering the workplace with a more equitable stake, like, that's incredible.
Exactly. And that's the whole thing, right? Is it's like, it's a lot harder to go back after 4 months than it is after 2 weeks. And, right before we started recording, we were talking about that I had just taken, my first 2-week vacation in a very long time. And I was also strategic about when I took it. I knew it was a time when not a lot of people would be, on email because it was over Thanksgiving. But, it's a very different thing than after being out for that longer period of time. On that, though, on the rest and also productivity and being a better worker, not so much on the, like, why haven't we gotten more diversity in the sector, but there is also research that shows that that workers will be more productive, they'll show up better, they'll be happier, and do better work if they are able to take 8 days consecutively off every quarter or so. And so also in an environment like the US, where a lot of times there is either very few vacation days that people are given, or, there's that new thing of like unlimited vacation days. That's actually like a really not great thing unless you actually encourage folks to take them or have like a minimum that you're like, you need to take these. Because people don't take vacation days when they have unlimited.
That was a great management technique. That was a great, I'll say that for you. That was a great smoke and mirror way to say, here, we'll make it not a conversation. And then you'll forget that it's a conversation, and then you won't take advantage of it because you won't have this pending sense that I have something I have to take advantage of, or else I'm going to lose it. And once we take that out of the equation, then suddenly we're just going to work more. Yeah, I mean, it's not. We are the dominant capitalist country that we have been over the last 75 years, largely because of these types of choices that we've made.
Right.
Which that's a whole other podcast on the sustainability of that. But I want to go back. You just teased it unintentionally, but I want to go back for a second, right? So we've given kind of one prescriptive suggestion to how firms can imbue more of a diversity, more equitable approach to their work. I didn't even expect that answer. It's awesome. Now let me ask you a little bit. Let's just get a couple of prescriptive ideas for how can male leaders of venture capital firms specifically diversify their investment teams. So I say that very specifically because I don't want you to tell me how they can diversify their community or their platform teams, because all due respect to them and our previous guests that we've had that have explained platform to us, we already know they know how to diversify that into the house.
Yeah.
So tell me, how can get just a couple of maybe 2 or 3 ideas on how male leaders of venture firms can diversify their investment teams?
So the biggest bang for your buck honestly comes by having like a structured recruitment and hiring process, which, let's be honest, most VC funds are basically startups themselves. And yet I would say that probably most of their portfolio companies hire better than they do, because they do it more, right? VC funds, we know they hire very poorly because they hire very infrequently. Although there's probably a lot of listeners who would say we don't hire poorly, so they might be angry at me for saying that. But the reality is that there's a lot of research behind this from various HR sources that all show that like you need to have a structured process in place that involves, for example, recruiting from broad swaths of society, right? Like not just your usual sort of industry groups, but really posting widely to cast a wide net. That also, there's a lot of research that has shown that if you ensure that your short list for interviews is 50-50 men and women, and also that you have at least one woman in the interviewing team, that you're 75% more likely to hire a woman. Okay. So like it works. And a lot of VC funds, when they are actually hiring, often they're working with recruiters, and recruiters are used to like this is their bread and butter. And so you tell a recruiter like, hey, listen, this is really important to us. They'll do it. They'll make sure that your shortlist has, equal men and women. There's not as much research on whether or not the same thing works from a racial equity perspective, but I would expect it to. Sure. It just obviously gets a little, and we do have some funds in our membership who actually do have that kind of mandate for their recruiters. I think the big thing, and that I will say, though, because I know that this conversation often veers into the whole like, oh, but are you advocating for quotas? No, we are not advocating for quotas. There's a big difference between ensuring that you have a diverse shortlist and then saying like you have to hire a woman, or right. It is those are two very different things. It's about ensuring that you are seeing a bigger pool of candidates, so you're truly hiring the best person for the job. No, and on that, I will say that I really like what Matthew Syed has to say on this topic in his book Rebel Ideas. So there's been a lot of conversation recently around, well, we want the best person for the job, the meritocracy versus DEI. I would argue, and Matthew Syed does a fantastic job arguing this in Rebel Ideas, that actually if you are truly, like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, building diversity into the business model of your fund because you understand that it's good for your business, then actually that leads into a much more meritocratic way of working. And what do I mean by that? There are, and I'm absolutely borrowing this from Rebel Ideas right now, but Matthew talks about there's two different types of problems, generally speaking, right? There's complex problems and there's simple problems. And to solve for a simple problem would be like a relay race. You need probably, there's four legs of the relay race. You need four people who are probably like pretty tall and gangly, long legs, thin, fast runners, right? Like you need four of the same type of person. It's a very homogeneous group to be able to solve that simple problem. But what most VCs and startups are working on are extremely complex problems. And that's actually most of the problems that we're dealing with in society today, whether
Right.
you're in venture capital or not, right? And so to solve for those complex problems, you need diversity of thought because the worst possible thing would be groupthink, right? Think Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
You like
Exactly.
you do not want groupthink. 13 Days, another fantastic book.
Yeah, that's right. By the way, one of my favorite movies of all time. You would not have known
Also,
that.
yes, yeah. And so, but if you are trying to build a team that will enable you to tackle those complex problems, you need folks who come from all different ways of life so that you can actually sort of create that 360 view around it. And what that means is that when you're hiring, you're looking for complementary skill sets as opposed to carbon copies of who you already have.
Yep.
And when you're looking for complementary skill sets, naturally that means you're looking for diversity and diversity of thought, right? Yeah. And you can have diversity of thought. It may end up that, you have three white men, but they're coming from very different backgrounds from a diversity of thought perspective, right? Like, I'm not saying that, like, there are many different types of diversity as we've talked about, and not all of it is visual.
No, 100%.
So
like you said, we could line up and there are things about you that no one would know. There are things about me that no one would appreciate. Those are diverse perspectives and unique points of view. That's hugely important. Yeah. That's terrific. Those are super prescriptive and very actionable, which I love. And I'm going to inject something before we go on. Just first context. This is I'm speaking for myself. I'm not putting words in your mouth here, right? But there may be or will be some men that are listening in my audience, or male venture investors that are listening that are immediately thinking like, we're bashing men, right? Or I am bashing the male VC. And you'd be wrong if you're thinking that, because that's actually not my point at all, right? In fact, the entire point of having this conversation with Megan today is to talk with her about how to figure out how to grow the industry economically, right? And a fundamental belief that just like in a macroeconomic sense of a country or the world, right, that firms can be better, that they can better capture better economic opportunities from more markets, that for their limited investment partners and their funds, they will essentially give themselves greater opportunities for greater returns because they will be, as you said, very astutely in the opening, kind of mitigating and diversifying their risk all at the same time, right? And then fundamentally, as you've again reinforced throughout some of your answers, more diverse teams makes any business. I don't care what business you're in. Venture capital is not special in this sense. A diverse team of leaders, and diverse cultural perspectives makes a team more attractive and competitive in their marketplace, and therefore a more attractive place to want to go to work at. So you're going to be able to have the chance to then recruit the best and truly brightest from across the entire cross-section of possible candidates. So everything about this episode, as I prepared for it in my head, and I knew you were going to be gracing us with your perspectives today, is actually driven not about the male VC, but we can't not call that out, right? We can't not call what the industry is out in an attempt to then explore how do we apply entrepreneurial thinking to it to help it, not to make it, but to help it become better. So thank you for giving. I just wanted to shout that out because I know there will be people that are, oh, here we go. Rob's going to talk about diversity and equality, right? And some folks may start to shut that off, and I don't want that to happen. To your very point there at the end, which is I have a widely diverse audience of people that listen to this for a whole bunch of different reasons. And I want to make sure that they're getting the central theme that the value that you and the firm bring is, as you so well said, right out the gate, is economic in nature, right? It's to drive better businesses. You're trying to help your partner clients in the industry to become better businesses. With that all said, tell us about the firm. Talk to us about Diversity VC. What does it do? Who are its clients? How is its work supported? Like, who are its benefactors, since it is a not-for-profit? This is your chance to kind of give us the commercial, and also maybe we'll get into some of what your vision of you and your team is going forward.
Yeah, so we are a nonprofit that, as I mentioned, we started in 2016 in the UK, and now we're active in the US, Latin America, and continental Europe as well. And fundamentally, our work is to support funds in being able to better leverage the diversity that exists in the markets that they're investing in, and take advantage of it and also benefit from it and create that virtuous cycle. And so a lot what that looks like is we have developed something called the Diversity VC Standards, which is our maturity assessment for funds, looking at, well, for example, on the internal operations side, do you have a code of conduct? What does that code of conduct include? Also looking at hiring policies and practices, but also then going into on the sort of business of the fund being investing, how is your due diligence process? Do you have repeatable practices such that every founder that enters top of funnel actually has the same experience, regardless of if they came from a warm intro or not? And because just like with hiring, the same thing is true when it comes to investing and due diligence. You really do need to have structures in place. It's not that infamous, like, oh, back of napkin. Like, honestly, most funds don't actually invest that way. They have a rubric, right, that they're scoring on. They have a scorecard. Sure. And so it's about making sure that is truly institutionalized and written down in such a way that anybody who enters the fund can understand how that process is run, and also such that any founder that is going through that process is going to more or less have a similar experience, and in such a way you can mitigate bias. I don't ever say you can de-bias anything. I don't believe that's possible. We're human, we're biased. But we can, and we create the processes, so they're probably somewhat biased too, but we can do our work to try to mitigate bias in that. And some examples of that being that there's been some very famous studies on how women founders are often asked questions about mitigating risk versus male founders being asked about opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why one of the things that we recommend to funds also is to have, we're not necessarily saying that you have to have like a script of questions that you ask every founder in your due diligence, but there should be sort of, if this is your rubric that you're scoring on, here are some examples of questions that people could ask to get to that type of answer, so that your team is also equipped to be able to ask questions in the right way and not be falling into that trap of asking promotion versus prevention questions. Yeah. And then we also look at how portfolio management and how you're supporting your portfolio also from a inclusion perspective. So that's most of our work with funds. And we also, of course, have peer-to-peer learning opportunities. We host community dinners for our community, and we also help them to source diverse talent for interns. And that we don't call them our clients, we call them our members. So
that was my bad choice of words. Yeah.
All good. So funds can become members of Diversity VC, awesome. And membership ranges according to AUM. But we really try to make it as accessible as possible to our funds of varying sizes. And then membership is generally into the community, but then and you can go through our standard assessment at any time, as many times as you'd like, and from that get an understanding of where you are and what are some ideas for areas of improvement, as well as what are your superpowers. We always like to celebrate. I love my work because I get to know what these funds are just incredible at, and then we get to ask them to share that with the community. And so it's everyone is at different points in their journey, and it's very likely that there's somebody else in our community who has already gone through that process that you're thinking about. So sure. I don't know, one example that came up recently was a fund in Argentina was interested in putting together a career progression framework for their team. And so we connected them with funds in France and the UK who we feel have done incredible jobs on that. And so, we get to make that sort of matchmaking happen within our community,
I love that.
which is really exciting.
No, talk about powerful. What a network effect, right? That to have in play and around something that is so fundamental. I love as I'm listening to you, just thinking kind of this collective. So here's this agency of sorts, right? And then there's this collective community around it of best practices around a set of fundamental themes, right? That is how do we again fundamentally diversify our venture capital firm. And so if you're a new young firm coming up and you're saying, my gosh, we really have the intention to do this, but how, and we don't know how, boom, there's value there, right? If you're an established firm that maybe is having a change in direction or a change in leadership and generationally so, and now there's an opportunity to reinvent itself, but you're like,
it's another form of diversity, by the way.
Right? We're not quite sure of our models. We're not quite sure how to do this. You've got a community and an organization to lean on. And I'm curious, I was going to presume this, but I want to ask instead, are there circumstances where member firms or firms that are entertaining membership in your community are driven to consider these types of improvements or changes by their LPs?
Yeah. So, yes, short answer, yes. I would say that most of our members have come to us of their own volition, but we do have, so actually, we recently finished up a pilot program with the Inter-American Development Bank. So the IDB, largest LP in Latin America, decided that they wanted to run a program for funds in their portfolio to help them to level up when it comes to just improving their policies and practices regarding inclusion and diversity. So the fund in Argentina was part of that pilot program, actually.
Yeah.
So yes, and we're in conversations with other LPs also, not only from a how can we support their funds in their portfolio, but also thinking about how can we integrate the standard into their due diligence, right? So that, and it's never going to be, or our intention is not for it to be like, oh, we won't invest because of this. And I think that's also really important. There are entities out there that you basically can't, quote unquote, pass unless you have 50-50 men and women on your team. I want to make something really clear. A lot of our fund members do not look from a diversity perspective the way that they are aiming to look, right? Like they have goals that they have not yet necessarily achieved.
Yep.
That is one of the reasons why they're members, is because they have that goal and because we work with them, and we're not grading you on like, do you have a woman on your IC today?
Right.
We're grading you on, okay, like how can we help you to put the policies and practices in place so that you can set yourself up? Because honestly, diversity for the sake of diversity doesn't work.
No, exactly.
You have to build inclusive practices. So how can we set you up so that as you then diversify your team, they will be set up for success and be able to contribute to the fund in the way that you're hoping for them to. They'll feel valued. They'll be able to then work their way up the ladder, right? It's a win-win for everyone. And then you create the opportunity where like, okay, now maybe you started out 3 men, all men partners, and now it's 3 men and 2 women, or whatever that ends up looking like. And so we do not count your staff from a diversity perspective.
No, it's to steal a phrase from our Constitution in the U.S., right? It's in pursuit of a more perfect union.
Yeah.
Right? Which literally was written in there to remind us that we are constantly we're in pursuit of it today. We will be in pursuit of it 200 years from now if we survive currently. We were in pursuit of it 240 years ago. So yeah, it's not there is no finished state. As there wouldn't be with an organization, especially if you have organizations like in venture capital where they have such long, ambitious time horizons, right? 10 years to 50, 60 years and all that kind of stuff. You mentioned, and we would be remiss because the roots of our relationship are in Latin America. You slipped in and mentioned about the IDB. And so I want to use that to jump ahead a little bit and ask a question. You co-authored the firm's intersectional diversity report. I would love for you to tell us, and it was, clarify, intersectional diversity report for Latin America, right? You co-authored it. We have deep ties to Latin America, a lot of interest in the region. What were a couple of the key takeaways for you in assembling that report in the context of everything we've been talking about today?
Well, I think one is that unfortunately we see the exact same challenges that we've seen in the US and Europe replicated in Latin America. So, I, like Latin America has a very special place in my heart. I actually think that as a region, as an ecosystem, there's a huge opportunity just because of the natural diversity that exists in Latin America in the population. I think there's a huge opportunity for the industry and the ecosystem to be ahead and to build this in. Also because of where we are in the region in terms of the industry, right? We're still at a pretty nascent stage. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there to build diversity in from maybe we're already at day one. So I don't know, maybe day 10, but like, I think there's
right. Like, yeah. I mean, if we're at year 10, 15 versus year 52, right? So, hey, you don't have to wait around for 52 years to just repeat the exact same pattern.
Exactly. And so, while the picture of what does the industry look like today is very much like it is in the US in terms of, for example, 66% of those in the industry, or our respondents at least, identified as being white, which, I mean, I'm sure anecdotally is not too surprising to you or me, given our work in the region. But I think for folks who are not as familiar with Latin America, I think one thing that I would just remind folks is, and I made the same sort of unconscious mistake when I first moved to the region, is, as an American looking at Latin America, and also as an American who cares about diversity, we talk a lot about like Latina or Latinx, right? Guess what? Once you enter Latin America, that's everyone, right? And so talking about like Latina or Latinx doesn't really fit the bill. You got to start digging deeper. And so actually, this gets me to another project that we're working on, because beyond the work that we do with funds, we also do a lot just ecosystem building. And so I'd say the two other main areas are around data and sort of talent pathways. And on the data piece, we launched earlier this year in the US our Diversity Data Alliance, and now we're working on similar alliances in the UK and Latin America. And part of this report was part of the impetus for that, because we found ourselves sitting around the table going, how do we talk about racial and ethnic diversity in Latin America? And so the way that we ended up doing it in this first report was very much basically borrowing from, okay, well, are you Asian or of Asian descent, Middle Eastern or of Middle Eastern descent, right? Like, because that is, rather than using, because some of our other options, for example, were, okay, do we use census data? Well, that creates some complexity in terms of how do we then harmonize that data on the back end. If we want to, we didn't want to be applying like an American lens on it, right? We didn't want to, so this is where we ended up. I would not say it is the perfect way to do it. And we may actually, upon further discussion with this group, which is made up of folks like LPs, GPs, other nonprofits like ourselves that are all committed to building this more inclusive VC ecosystem in Latin America, we may end up going actually back towards the idea of how we collect that data, how that data is collected in the census, partially because, again, the nascency of the ecosystem in LATAM, we're also in a nascent time for this conversation around diversity in LATAM. And so there's a lot more familiarity with the terms, with asking somebody, oh, are you of Asian descent in the US or in Europe, than there is in Latin America. And so just asking people in terms that they are familiar with. Now, I will say in the US, we made a conscious decision not to use census categories. And part of that was because we felt like, okay, as an industry, we are more progressive. We recognize that there are some, like there's hindrances with using the census categories. And in fact, one thing that we had added within the Data Alliance to our classification for race and ethnicity was Middle Eastern. And then in April, the census announced that they were adding Middle Eastern to the census categories. So we felt very vindicated in that.
Right.
I don't think that they saw our data and said that, oh, we need to do this, but we definitely
thought prescient timing.
Yeah. So, I think there's a lot
of critical takeaways. I mean, like a lot of foundational takeaways related to the analysis. So how do we enter the market? How do we understand them? Right. Just that is a huge takeaway. The appreciation, which is not surprising coming from you as an individual, but it's nice to see that it's kind of baked into the process of the reporting and the research, which is to understand the cultural nuance of a country and even a city inside of a country versus another part of the region of that same country. And then those people versus the people who are from the neighboring countries and the region, all that, as you and I learned, again, mostly the hard way, by trial and error, by being in the region. But that's the best way to hear you applying that to the fundamentals. That's awesome, because inevitably then you'll learn, I would assume, you will learn the most appropriate, healthiest modeling to do. Yeah. Right. And then that will probably help you accelerate the acceptability of that information into the community, which then means then the community takes ownership of it and essentially decides to use these facts as the basis for their actions and their cases that they make with one another to persuade others, right, to diversify the industry. They have it be what you and I just said. We're like, hey, you don't have to do everything over again for 50 years. You could decide at year 15 that you want to make a decision that no one in the US ever made in the 1980s, right? Like you can decide that now because you're building from this perspective. That's awesome. That's really important.
That's our hope for sure. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our other members of the Data Alliance in the US. They are Together International, focused on founders with disability, Alraise, focused on women and non-gender conforming founders and investors, Black VC, focused on Black community and venture capital, Somos VC, the Latina, Latinx community in venture capital, Start Out, LGBTQIA plus community in venture capital, as well as founders, and Vets in Tech, who are focused on veterans community in both founders and investors.
Incredible. What a lineup of allies. That's a fantastic group of people right there.
Yeah, it is. And I'm sure we have we have a lot more work that we're working on behind the scenes as well.
It's incredible. You guys have made yourselves, and this is it's the fun part of doing this show for me is always is something I didn't know that I learned, right? So I had an impression of what I thought Diversity VC was based on what I thought of your work and what I know of your work, what I know of some of your teammates. And now you've fleshed out like this much broader version of it, which is really exciting for me now to think that there is an organization that is so centrally valuable, although I'm sure you still have to make your case for how valuable you are to different segments of the industry, but to have, burrowing yourselves in, so to speak, to be such key players, this is absolutely what the industry needs. That's really encouraging. All right. So I have a couple questions before we get to our closing segment. One, and maybe you have a couple of stories to share, maybe there's something that comes top of mind, but what are some of the firms that are members of the community tell you about their work, either like what they thought about it before they joined and became a member, and then how it played out afterwards, or just the underlying anecdotal story of the testimonial maybe of the value to their business that being part of the community has been? Do you have a couple examples that you could share?
Yeah, I don't usually give examples with fund names just to respect.
I was going to say, I usually should have said that. Like we could keep the names anonymous for privacy-based sake.
But certainly, I think to give an example of one fund, they're a pretty major European fund that they've been members since the beginning, and they were one of the first funds to go through the Diversity VC standard when we launched it in 2020. And one of the pieces of feedback that they gave us was just how positive it was to have that almost forced self-reflection on their processes. And part of what then came out of that was a really deep conversation amongst the investment team together with their head of ESG around, okay, so why do we care about diversity? And this is sort of what I was alluding to earlier around, they said, okay, well, why do we care about diversity? Well, we care about diversity because we care about diversity of thought. Okay, so then what does diversity of thought mean to us? And they decided amongst themselves that for them, diversity of thought looks like gender, race and ethnicity, nationality, and socioeconomic status or socioeconomic class, right? And then following on from that, though, is the question of like, okay, so then how are we collecting or measuring that, right? Like meaningfully? Because those four categories that I just mentioned have varying degrees of sensitivity, also, right? In terms of how we collect that data, how we talk to people about their experiences. And so ultimately, they have created a way, a forum for themselves to be able to, okay, some of this data we can probably collect pretty top of funnel. Gender is a pretty easy one to ask folks about these days. Also, race and ethnicity, nationality may or may, like, depending on the political climate, right? That may or may not come out. Socioeconomic class, you're definitely not asking that about like at top of funnel, right? That is
Right.
a later conversation as you get to know the founder. And so,
Sure.
I think I loved hearing this from them. And actually, they shared this in an AMA that we did just amongst our members, because that's exactly the kind of thought process that we hope funds will go through as they're going through the
Absolutely.
standard, right? Is to have that reflection and to truly build it into their investment model, into their business.
No, it's incredible. Into their investment model, it essentially winds up coloring their thesis at some point, and of course becomes part of the culture of the firm,
Exactly.
right? Which I mean,
Yeah.
that's your dream. That's a fantastic story.
Yeah.
All right, so now this next question, and this is the last question in our main conversation. We'll get to our closing question, where you can give a couple of tips and ideas, but this one's not going to be quite as easy as that one. So here's we're in, at least in the U.S. I'm sure there are aspects of what I'm about to ask that are true everywhere, but right in the United States right now, we're in a geopolitical cultural moment that has us kind of shifting back away from DEI as a concept, the efforts behind it, et cetera. I tend to believe that we're maybe just talking about it less, but the organizations or the companies that were truly committed to it principally already, they're still doing it. We're just not going to advertise it as much, right? To not bring upon that spotlight. But I'm curious, obviously, literally the title of your company, right? Diversity VC. And then with all the context of what you just described to us that you work on and the value that you provide to your community and industry, how is, if at all, this geopolitical cultural moment, the shift backwards or the shift away from DEI in the US, how's it affecting the firm, and how is it affecting the industry in your perspective?
It's interesting because, as you mentioned, we're global. Um, and so I will say that the Europeans are looking at the Americans like, what is going on over there?
All right, welcome to the club, Europeans.
Yeah. So this is a moment in the US. It is not so much a moment in Europe. There are well, I don't know if it's a majority, but a large number of funds in Europe that are, they're moving forward with building more inclusive practices and policies in their funds, and they're going to continue to. And a lot of that actually has to do with the fact that the EU is a massive LP, and so
Okay.
or the European Investment Bank, really, and they're probably an LP in like 95% of the European VC funds, and they have various ESG requirements that include DEI requirements.
Okay.
So over
And you
there,
alluded to earlier, you just recently answered, you alluded to kind of the coalition of organizations and stakeholders in Latin America who are coming together to kind of embrace these root issues. So it's a
yeah,
U.S. thing. Is it affecting your work? And again, not like, is it affecting the firm's presence or ability to advance its agenda here in the United States, or is it just, it is what it is, and it's a lot of noise, and we forge ahead, and there are still lots of interested venture capitalists and stakeholders in different ecosystems in different cities around the country that are going to grow anyways.
I believe, like you said in sort of your preamble to the question, that the folks that truly believe that diversity is critical to them generating the returns that they are committed to generating for themselves and for their LPs will continue to do this work. They'll continue to care. It's going to continue to be a part of their business model. And we're going to continue to do our work. Now, we may not use the words DEI in the US, I'll be honest.
Sure. That's fair.
But I don't know, like, I don't know if the words matter so much as just like doing the work. Um,
Right.
and I will also say one piece of hope, I guess, that I have from this is that I think that there has been a bit of a DEI became such a like the thing to do that there are quite a few folks who jumped on the bandwagon without really asking themselves why they were doing it.
A lot of inauthentic, as you said, bandwagon jumping
Yeah.
to a perceived cause.
And look, they may have done it for good reasons, right? But
Sure.
they didn't stop to ask why. And that matters because if they didn't stop to ask why, and they were really only doing it because they thought it was the right thing to do, which I do believe it is, but if that was the
Yep.
only reason why they were doing it, then again, it was a nice to have, and it never became something critical or integral to their business.
Right.
And when that's the case, it's really easy. Yeah, times get hard. It's a difficult market right now. A lot of funds are not raising the amounts that they were hoping to raise, and they just kind of forget about it.
But to your point, right, and to our perfect example, like our friends at Supply Change Capital, who,
Yep.
by the way, I show this mug so often now, ladies, you should just become a sponsor of the show. But right to that point is that there are lots of people who wake up every day, and it wasn't an easy performative throwaway, and so therefore, when times get tough, they just double down on their intentions and their mission because they have asked the why, and then they put the thought work into the how, the what, the when, the who. And so that's where diversity VC. The answer that I'm hearing is that's where diversity VC leans in and says, "Okay, you're here. We're here to help you do this."
Yeah.
Right, which is great. And along the way, may you convince, may you bring some naysayers along over time. May you convert some of the non-converted, possibly. But my dad used to say, you know what? Don't spend your time trying to convert the non-convertible. Go preach to the people who already loosely believe in what you believe in, and just help them grow. Right? I was like, okay, yeah, that's a good sales strategy.
Hey, I will say, my inbox is open. Like, I welcome conversations with folks who disagree with us, partially because I'd like to learn. I'd like to hear what they have to say. I think that there's not
Sure.
enough conversations going on, actually human to human or person to person, and a lot of this is playing out in the headlines and or on social media, and that doesn't really do anybody any good.
Nope.
So
I mean, you're a supporter and fan of this show for years. So it's not surprising that you just very subtly tipped a cap to the fact that long form conversation matters.
yeah.
Right. Or as I said on another podcast 2 Fridays ago, right, we should stop pretending that the world and things are not complex, because they are.
Yeah.
So we should have long conversations with lots of different people to try and sort out very complex things.
Yeah. And you yourself mentioned something earlier today also about the demographic shifting in the country, right? Like, this shift is inevitable. And so what that means is that we need to find, as a community, I'm going to call this nation a community, we need to find ways to work together so that we can all do better.
Because, as you said, and now we're playing tit for tat with what we said already in the show, right? Because of what you said at the very beginning is that there is far more in common with one another than there is that's different than you. And I know for sure that you and I both discovered that on our travels and our lives throughout Latin America, when we were the minority in every room that we were in, and we came to appreciate and understand how similar people are, instead of just focusing on the fact that there are differences in everybody. So I think that's both beautiful
and it's Sesame Street. Remember, Rob, it's all for
right.
Sesame Street.
This is all Sesame Street. This is the dream. This is the aspiration. So thank you for that. All right. So I have one last question. This is the closing segment, and there's a bunch you could share, I know, but let's just try and see if we can't nail it down to like 3 recommendations. What would be 3 recommendations that you would make, sitting in the chair that you sit in now, that could create significant change in the venture capital industry going forward? What are kind of maybe 3 principles that Diversity VC says, okay, if we can be better at this, like you talked about some of the things throughout the show, if you can be better at this, if we can be better at this, we will create better outcomes. What are those 3 things?
So one, I would say, is definitely the like have equal family leave. And I would include, what we talked a lot about, like birthing, non-birthing, et cetera. But I would also say that also goes for other forms of care. So, just having more equitable policies around parental and family leave and enforcing them. That's the critical piece.
That's a huge one. Our friend Erica Lucas at Vest Her and Stitch Crew in Oklahoma City, she talks a ton now about the care economy and the caregivers portion of this world that we live in. And so familial and parental support is huge.
Yeah. Especially because the millennials are this sandwich generation, right? Where it's like, and I spent most of this year caring for my mom while she was going through cancer treatment. Thankfully, she is now healthy. But, so there is that whole sort of caring for parents, caring for little ones, and it just pushes down. And so I think that's going to be really, really crucial as we go forward. I would also say, and I know we could have an entire other podcast about this. So measure what you're doing. And so, we are in support of SB 54, which is a law that was passed last year in California that will be mandating funds to be reporting on the diversity of their portfolio companies, and part of the reason why, and this is that we believe this is super important, and the reason why we've been behind creating these diversity data alliances in the various regions is because we believe that it is absolutely crucial to be collecting this data, because if we're not measuring it, we can't change it. And so it's not about calling people out, it's about calling people in, right? This is not about saying like, oh my gosh, look, you're doing a terrible job. No. It is about saying, having a more easily accessible source of that data to be able to also track it over time. And quite honestly, stop with all these reports that are a bit depressing to see that things aren't changing over time.
Right.
But to be able to continue tracking it and figure out and better test what interventions actually work.
That's fantastic. Really important. Those are two pretty big ones. I'll let you off the hook on the third one if you want. Those are, you mentioned the first, and we talked about it extensively in the earlier part of the show, so people can go back and reference that. And then this importance of the data. I love that. You just said calling people in, not calling them out, right? Essentially saying, and I'll reference something you also said earlier, right? It's saying, recognizing to firms that are interested in being better, that are working with good intentions towards the pursuit of a better version of themselves, the pursuit of that better union we said before, saying, hey, come on in, no matter where you're at on the spectrum of progress, and we're going to take your data that exists there. And then the great news is you're going to be surrounded by firms that are at all different places on the spectrum, and you'll be able to learn from them. They'll be able to see and validate some of what they see in you, and maybe this will help you accelerate your progress against your intentions. So I think and that comes from, again, data, right? So let's get past the just PR mill of repetitive headlines, which aren't even necessarily like truly verified research reporting. It's just some data collection that somebody did in a random survey, and it says like, oh, look it's terrible. We're terrible.
Yeah.
And so I almost was listening to you. I was feeling like this. Let's gather a common set of facts that we can agree are the facts.
Well, and this is where like every piece of data tells a story, right? And so like our work with the Data Alliance started out because we wanted to be able to share data sets. And then we realized, well, wait a second, we're actually, even though we're tracking the same things, we're tracking them differently. We're asking the questions differently. So the very first piece of work that we've had to do in each of these different regions is to say, okay, so let's standardize how we ask the questions and what the possible answers are. Now, then it comes to also, there's where are you sourcing that data, et cetera. And one of the things actually that came out of our report in Latin America was we had almost equal participation of women and men in the surveys. In fact, actually, we had slightly more women participate, which ended up skewing some of the data, right? And so one of our sponsors was like, oh my gosh, but so does this mean that there's no problem? And I was like, no, this means that the problem is way bigger than we thought. Because the men are not replying to a survey that's about diversity because they don't think there's a problem. Why should I reply?
Right.
The women are replying in like far overrepresentative numbers because they feel so unseen.
Right. They're like, holy crap, where do I sign up? You just asked for my opinion on these things? Let me fill out your survey. I don't care how long it takes.
Exactly.
That's an incredible insight right there. There's your mic drop at the end of the show. I will say to you, as I always say, as I said, when you agreed to come on the show, thank you. Just thank you for being you, for just the way that you approach everything that you do. I'm not at all shocked. It's been a few years since we've seen each other in this context, and So to have witnessed your growth but now to hear it very tactically is awesome. And I couldn't think of a better marriage of your skill sets and your experiences and your passions with an organization in need of additional leadership and additional context. So what you guys are doing as a firm with you in this co-CEO role, along with your partners and the rest of your team, is incredible. And I've had the good fortune in this last year to meet a couple of your team members, trying to help, people find some things in places here.
You have played a role in helping to support us, so thank you.
No, it's awesome. So thank you for that. And thank you for this. This was truly illuminating. I came in again with a sense of, I thought I knew what I knew. And I always leave room for the fact that I didn't know a lot of things, but the level of detail is what has really impressed me about what the organization is doing. And then the ambitiousness of it without getting lost in just the performative part of that ambition, right? You're on the ground. You're doing the roll up the sleeves work in your different cities and in your different countries. And that's critically important. It's fundamentally what will help this industry be different, so that when when Leo's doing a podcast 50 years from now, and he's asking what the industry looks like at the 100th anniversary of it, it'll be different than it was, because you and I are talking about what it looks like in its middle age.
I hope so.
But it's got an opportunity to be better. So thanks for hanging out. Thanks for spending some time with me.
Do you mind if I just share sort of 3 things generally that we're looking forward to in 2025?
Please go for it.
So one is around, we're sort of relaunching our talent pathways program, so to help folks to help diversifying the talent in venture capital. And so we've just recently launched our career development program, which is for senior associates and principals to help them to level up and accelerate that path to partner. So we're really excited about that. And we're also in conversations with a few folks to possibly do a similar program for emerging managers, but that would also include coaching for emerging managers. And then, of course, through the Data Alliance, we're actually jointly, in this consortium working to build what would be like the largest intersectional database for our industry.
Incredible.
And then finally, looking towards with the standards, I sort of mentioned briefly in our conversation, we're in conversations, we're looking to see how we can, you mentioned, did any of these funds do this because their LPs are asking about it? We're looking to work with more LPs to integrate the standard into their due diligence processes, so that this really is not an afterthought. It's actually a part of the evaluation. And then later, hopefully, support of those funds, right? And so I think those are the things that I'm most excited about for next year. And, like I said, we will continue to do this work. Definitely the environment changes a lot, but I'm excited about the coalition building and sort of being in community over the next year.
That's awesome. You're on a long journey, right? And the headwinds have just shifted against us instead of in our favor. And so it just makes the journey a little bit longer and a little bit harder. But fundamentally, you're still on that journey towards that shore that you're aiming at. So please keep doing that. How can folks, if they want to follow along, find or sign up for anything, how can they find you or the firm? You share whatever you'd like to share.
Our website is diversity.vc. So very easy. We're also on LinkedIn, and folks can feel free to email info@diversity.vc if they have questions and like to get in touch, and or find me on LinkedIn. Include a note that says you listen to the podcast. I'm much more likely to accept.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, happy to have folks subscribe to our newsletter, or interested in becoming members, or even just interested in, like I said, disagreeing with me. Please.
Right. The inbox is open, as we said. I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is terrific.
Thanks, Rob.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did recording it. As always, we thank you so much for listening and watching. Today's show was recorded here in Los Angeles and produced by the incomparable Deanna Bernal in Mexico City. We can only grow this show by you listening and sharing the show with friends. So please find, follow, subscribe, and and share our audio-only show on Spotify, Apple, or via any other popular podcasting platforms, as well as find the video version of our show now available on our YouTube channel over at Entrepreneurial Thinkers. And of course, you can follow along on our various social media platforms for fun and informative clips and content at Entrepreneurial Thinkers, wherever you can find us. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me at I Am Rob Ryan on just about any social media platform. Gracias, thank you, and have an awesome day.